The gray, churning waters of the Columbia River bar, the notorious graveyard of the Pacific, crashed against the concrete pilings of Coast Guard Station Cape Disappointment with a rhythm that sounded like distant artillery. 76-year-old Jimmy Dalton pushed his rusted maintenance cart along the wet flight line, his weathered face carved deep by decades of Pacific Northwest storms and experiences that nobody at this station had ever bothered to ask about. The faded red work shirt he wore daily hung loose on his lean frame, the fabric soft from countless washings and permanently stained by honest sweat, hydraulic fluid, and salt spray, paired with blue jeans worn thin at the knees and brown work boots that had lost their shine years ago. His neatly trimmed white beard caught the ocean spray as he methodically checked equipment and hull fittings with the deliberate precision of a man who understood that lives depended on proper maintenance, even if others saw him as nothing more than the old boat mechanic, with shaky hands and outdated knowledge. To the elite aviation survival technicians of Air Station Cape Disappointment preparing for their morning training evolution, Jimmy was simply part of the infrastructure. Invisible support personnel who kept boats running and equipment maintained, while real Coast Guardsmen prepared to save lives in the world's most dangerous waters. He'd been working boat and aircraft maintenance at the station for 12 years since his retirement, and the young rescue swimmers saw him as nothing more than a relic from a different era, telling the same tired sea stories to anyone polite enough to listen. Aviation survival technician first-class Kyle "Shark" Vance, 29 years old and built like an Olympic swimmer, led his team of 6 rescue swimmers across the tarmac toward the waiting MH-60 Jayhawk helicopter with the confident swagger that came with jumping into conditions that would kill most people. His orange dry suit bore the distinctive aviation survival technician badge and rescue swimmer patch, and his presence radiated the kind of controlled power that came with being one of the Coast Guard's most elite operators. Around him moved 5 other swimmers, their conversation focused on the day's training scenario, simulated helicopter insertions into heavy seas with multiple casualty recoveries. The morning briefing had called for marginal conditions, 15-foot seas, 20-knot winds, nothing these swimmers hadn't handled countless times before. The forecast showed a low-pressure system moving up the coast, predicted to stay well offshore and pass east of their training area. Jimmy had been performing routine maintenance on the Jayhawk's rescue hoist when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The barometric pressure dropping faster than any weather service predicted, combined with a specific chaotic cross-chop pattern in the water that didn't match the prevailing wind direction. It was a subtle sign, invisible to radar and satellites, but to eyes that had read these waters for decades, it screamed of a sneaker wave event building beyond the river mouth. "Petty Officer Vance," Jimmy said quietly, approaching the group as they conducted pre-dive equipment checks near the helicopter, "you might want to reconsider today's training evolution. That bar is breaking weird, tides turning against the river outflow, and there's a pressure drop that's setting up for rogue sets. The foam lines are running counterclockwise off the North Jetty, which means the bottom's churning up. You're looking at 25 to 30-foot seas by mid-morning, maybe worse with vertical faces that'll snap this bird in half." The suggestion hung in the salt air like fog rolling in from the Pacific. Vance looked up from his equipment check, his expression shifting from professional focus to the kind of condescending amusement reserved for well-meaning but incompetent civilians. "Morning, Jimmy," he replied, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure his team could hear every word. "Appreciate the concern, but we've got actual meteorologists with Doppler radar, satellite imagery, and oceanographic data telling us conditions are safe for training. I think we'll trust the professionals over gut feelings and old sailor superstitions." Aviation survival technician, second-class Danny Hammer Williams stepped forward with obvious condescension, his rescue swimmer physique and confident bearing speaking to years of elite training. "No offense, Jimmy, but we train in conditions most people can't even imagine. 15-foot seas are a walk in the park for us. Maybe stick to changing oil and leave the weather assessment to people with actual meteorological training and college degrees." Jimmy's steel-gray eyes remained calm, his weathered hands steady on his cart handle despite their slight tremor. The Pacific spray misted his faded red work shirt as he looked past the breakwater where the swell had begun to stack in an ugly, uneven rhythm that spoke of violence building beyond the horizon. "The ocean doesn't care about your radar, petty officer," he said quietly, his gravelly voice carrying the weight of hard-won experience. And it definitely doesn't care about your college degrees. When that white water turns brown with bottom sediment, it means the undertow will hold you down till your lungs burst. But you're the swimmers, it's your call. The harassment escalated dramatically as aviation survival technician first-class Vance decided to turn the morning briefing into public entertainment at Jimmy's expense. Word spread quickly across Air Station Cape Disappointment that the old boat mechanic was offering expert meteorological analysis to Coast Guard rescue swimmers, and soon a crowd of aircrew, boat crews, and station personnel had gathered near the Jayhawk like predators sensing weakness. "Listen up, everyone," Vance announced, his voice carrying across the wet tarmac with theatrical authority. "Our resident oceanographer here has been dropping hints about his sea knowledge for months, telling us old sailors' tales about reading foam patterns. Time to put up or shut up, old man." Aviation survival technician second class Williams pulled out his phone, framing Jimmy in the screen with obvious malicious intent. "This is perfect content," he announced to his growing audience of nearly 20 Coast Guardsmen. "Some confused old mechanic trying to lecture actual rescue swimmers about ocean conditions. My followers are gonna eat this up. #delusional civilian, #armchair meteorologist." The laughter was sharp and cruel, echoing off the concrete and aluminum of the hangar complex. Jimmy remained calm beside his maintenance cart, his weathered hands continuing their methodical work despite the verbal bombardment. His steel-gray eyes held that same unsettling depth that had unnerved better sailors than these boys. The Pacific spray intensified around his faded red work shirt, salt water darkening the collar, but his voice stayed steady as he examined the chaotic cross-chop patterns beyond the Columbia River bar with practiced precision. The breaking point came when Lieutenant Commander Sarah Storm Martinez, the air operations officer, arrived to approve the training evolution. Instead of dispersing the crowd, she decided to join the entertainment. "What's the commotion, Vance?" she asked, her voice carrying the authority of command and the casual dismissiveness of someone who trusted satellites over intuition. "Ma'am, our boat mechanic here has been sharing his weather expertise," Vance explained with theatrical reverence. "Apparently, he can predict rogue wave formations better than NOAA buoys and our meteorological systems combined. We're just trying to learn from his vast oceanographic expertise." The sarcasm was thick enough to cut with a dive knife. Martinez's eyes showed impatience mixed with amusement. "Is that so? Well, Jimmy, as an actual Coast Guard officer with a meteorology degree and 15 years of flight operations, I'm always interested in learning from experienced mariners. What's your background, your credentials? Or is this just another case of an old salt telling sea stories?" The sound of helicopter rotors and cruel laughter began to warp and fade around Jimmy, replaced by the roar of different engines in a different storm. The wet Cape Disappointment tarmac dissolved into the freezing, mountainous seas off the Alaskan coast, where the stakes of weather reading weren't embarrassment, but survival. It was February 1974, and bosun's mate First Class James Dalton was at the helm of Coast Guard motor lifeboat CG-44300, fighting 30-foot seas in the Gulf of Alaska. A fishing trawler was taking on water with 6 souls aboard, and the weather forecast had called for improving conditions. But Jimmy's trained eyes had seen what the meteorologists missed: the same hydraulic interference patterns he'd just tried to warn Vance about, pressure gradients creating localized acceleration zones that would turn manageable seas into survival conditions. "Coxswain, forecast shows a window," his young engineer had called over the diesel engine's roar, his voice tight with fear. Jimmy had studied the water's surface, reading the story written in foam patterns and wave interference. "Forecast's wrong," he'd replied calmly. "See how the foam's running counter to the wind? That's upwelling from a pressure cell the satellites can't detect. We've got maybe 10 minutes before this turns ugly." He'd been right. They'd rescued all 6 fishermen using the hydraulic zones as shelter instead of fighting through them, bringing everyone home alive because Jimmy had read the ocean's language instead of trusting the forecast. The memory dissolved as Martinez's voice cut through the spray. "What makes you think you know more about ocean conditions than trained meteorologists with real-time data?" Jimmy's steel-gray eyes refocused on the young officer. "Experience, Commander," he replied quietly. "Sometimes the most important data comes from reading what the instruments can't measure." Lieutenant Commander Martinez's harassment reached a fever pitch as the gray Pacific morning intensified across Air Station Cape Disappointment. transforming what had started as casual mockery into a public tribunal with Jimmy as the accused. "Listen up, everyone," Martinez announced, her voice echoing across the wet tarmac with theatrical authority that drew personnel from adjacent hangars and boat bays. "Our resident oceanographer here has been telling sea stories for months, dropping hints about his rescue experience. Time for some accountability. I want to see his Coast Guard service record, his meteorological credentials, his qualifications, or I want him to admit he's been wasting our time with old sailors' superstition." The crowd swelled to over 25 Coast Guardsmen, rescue swimmers, pilots, boat crews, and station support staff, their phones openly recording what they expected to be prime social media content. The exposure of another delusional old-timer who couldn't distinguish between folklore and science. Aviation survival technician First Class Vance stepped forward with renewed malicious energy, feeding off his commander's vindictive momentum. "Yeah, what's your real story, Jimmy? Supply clerk who watched the ocean from a safe pier, motor pool hero who never left the harbor? Or did you just buy that Coast Guard veteran cap at a surplus store and decide to play pretend for the rest of your life?" Aviation survival technician, second class Williams held his phone prominently, framing Jimmy for his followers with the practiced eye of someone who understood social media engagement. "This is perfect content," he announced. Some confused old mechanic trying to lecture actual Coast Guard rescue swimmers about ocean conditions. Hashtag stolen valor, hashtag delusional civilian. The laughter grew sharper, meaner, as the crowd fed off each other's cruelty, their professional discipline dissolving into mob mentality. The breaking point came when Martinez issued her ultimatum, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the gathered crowd. "That's it, Jimmy. You're done offering weather advice in my area of operations. Either prove you're who you've been implying you are, or admit you're wasting our time and we'll let station security escort you off this base. This is a professional Coast Guard facility, not a retirement home for confused old men telling sea stories." Jimmy's weathered hands remained steady on his cart handle despite the verbal bombardment, his steel-gray eyes holding a depth that none of them could understand. The Pacific spray intensified around him, salt water soaking his faded red work shirt, but his voice stayed calm. "Commander," he said quietly, his gravelly voice cutting through the noise, "that cross-chop pattern beyond the North Jetty is creating hydraulic interference zones where the river outflow meets the incoming swell. The foam lines running counterclockwise mean bottom sediment is being pulled up by undertow currents your buoys can't measure. When brown water starts mixing with white water, it means the undertow will hold a swimmer down for 2 to 3 minutes, longer than anyone can hold their breath in cold water shock." From the operations center doorway, Senior Chief Bosun's mate Robert Boats, Harlan had been watching the spectacle with growing unease. At 54, with 32 years of Coast Guard service, Harlan had commanded more bar crossings than most people had hot meals. He'd transferred to Cape Disappointment 3 years earlier and quickly learned to trust one thing above all: the judgment of men who had survived storms the textbooks never fully explained. And there was something about Jimmy's tone, not defiant, not dramatic, just flat certainty, that set off alarms deeper than pride. As Martinez prepared for her final assault, Harlan studied Jimmy with the analytical precision that had kept him alive through decades of the most dangerous maritime operations in Coast Guard history. The way the old man held himself despite his age, shoulders unconsciously squared in the coxswain's stance, weight balanced on the balls of his feet, ready to move with the deck. The controlled breathing under extreme pressure. The eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the ocean's surface while processing crowd dynamics. Most telling were the faint scars around his hands where lines had cut deep during heavy weather operations, and the barely visible mark on his temple where flying debris had struck during a rescue gone wrong. The recognition hit Harlan like a rogue wave. The name on Jimmy's faded ID badge, Dalton J., scratched at a memory from his early career. Years ago, during advanced coxswain training in Alaska, an instructor had told a story about a legendary bosun's mate who could read weather patterns that satellites missed. Seamanship so uncanny they'd called him Hurricane, a man credited with impossible rescues in conditions that should have killed everyone involved, a man who'd quietly retired before most of the current generation ever made it north. Name was Dalton, that instructor had said. Jimmy Dalton. If he told you not to go, you didn't go. Didn't matter what the forecast said. Harlan pulled out his secure phone with hands that trembled slightly, not from age, but from the magnitude of what he was witnessing. He scrolled to a number he rarely used, the direct line to Captain David Lifesaver Thompson, the commanding officer of Sector Columbia River. "This is Thompson," came the crisp response. "Sir, Senior Chief Harlan at Cape Disappointment. I need you here immediately. We have a critical situation involving our boat mechanic James Dalton and Lieutenant Commander Martinez's flight crew." Harlan's voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. "Sir, I believe James Dalton is bosun's mate, First Class James Hurricane Dalton, the coxswain from the Gulf of Alaska rescue of 1974. The silence on the other end was immediate and absolute. Every Coast Guardsman who knew their service's history understood that the 1974 Gulf of Alaska rescue was legendary. A motor lifeboat crew that had saved 18 souls in conditions that officially exceeded survivable parameters, operating in seas that should have killed everyone aboard. "Are you certain, Senior Chief?" Thompson's voice had lost all traces of casual conversation, replaced by the sharp focus of a commander facing a crisis. "The scars match the heritage photographs, sir. The bearing, the way he's reading hydraulic patterns that our best instruments can't detect. The specific technical knowledge of undertow dynamics that only comes from thousands of hours at the helm in survival conditions," Harlan replied, watching as Martinez prepared to physically escort Jimmy from the station. "Sir, if I'm right about who this man is, what's happening here isn't just disrespectful. It's a desecration of everything we stand for as Coast Guardsmen." Meanwhile, Command Master Chief Petty Officer Lisa Rescue Rodriguez, the station's senior enlisted leader with 24 years of service, had been observing from the hangar doorway with growing alarm. Her 2 decades of maritime rescues had taught her to recognize the signs of true water sense, and she pulled out her military phone to dial the District 13 Command Master Chief. "Command Master Chief, this is Rodriguez at Cape Disappointment. We've got a situation with a civilian boat mechanic named James Dalton. Sir, I think this might be the Dalton hurricane from the Alaskan storm." In his office, Captain Thompson was already accessing restricted databases, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The personnel system showed only basic civilian employment records, but when he accessed the classified Coast Guard historical archives, the screen populated with a service record that made his blood run cold. "Gold Life-Saving Medal, BM-1 James R. Dalton, Gulf of Alaska, 1974. The citation read, "For extreme heroism while serving as coxswain of motor lifeboat CG-44300 during rescue operations in survival condition. Successfully rescued 18 persons from 3 vessels in mountainous seas exceeding 40 feet. Demonstrated extraordinary seamanship and weather-reading abilities that saved all lives at extreme risk to his own." The recognition chain was now racing through the highest levels of Coast Guard District 13. Carried by professionals who understood that Martinez was about to commit an act of sacrilege against one of the most legendary coxswains in Coast Guard history. Phones rang in offices throughout the Pacific Northwest, awakening memories of heroes thought lost to time and setting in motion a response that would forever change how the young rescue swimmers viewed the difference between technology and the hard-won wisdom earned through salt water, fear, and the kind of seamanship that couldn't be taught in classrooms or programmed into weather computers. The gray Pacific sky seemed to press down on Cape Disappointment like a physical weight, the low-pressure system flexing its muscles with sudden, unpredictable gusts that sent salt spray across the wet tarmac. But the sound that suddenly cut through the building storm and crashing surf wasn't the rising wind. It was the deep, urgent rumble of approaching vehicles. A convoy of 3 black SUVs bearing Coast Guard Sector Columbia River plates roared through the security gate with synchronized purpose, followed by the commanding officer's staff car flying the distinctive scarlet and blue pennant that made every Coast Guardsman on the station snap to attention. Captain David Lifesaver Thompson emerged first, his operational dress uniform immaculate despite the urgency of his arrival and the salt spray misting across the flight line. At 56, Thompson was a living legend within the Coast Guard rescue community, weathered, gray-haired, with steel-blue eyes that had scanned horizons in every major storm since the perfect storm of '91. His chest bore ribbons from operations that had pushed the limits of human endurance, including his own gold life-saving medal and multiple distinguished flying crosses. Behind him stepped Senior Chief Bosun's mate Robert Boats, Harlan and Command Master Chief Petty Officer Lisa Rescue Rodriguez, both radiating the same iron discipline that came with decades of managing life-and-death operations in the world's most dangerous maritime environment. The assembled Coast Guardsmen on the tarmac snapped to rigid attention in uneven waves as the command element approached, their earlier mockery and laughter dying instantly like foam disappearing into sand. Lieutenant Commander Martinez froze mid-gesture, her hand still pointing toward Jimmy in accusation, the color draining from her face as she realized the magnitude of command attention now focused on her harassment of the old boat mechanic. The phones that had been recording Jimmy's supposed humiliation were hastily pocketed, replaced by the cold realization that their casual cruelty had somehow reached the highest levels of sector command. Captain Thompson didn't look at them first. His eyes went straight to the elderly man in the faded red work shirt standing beside a rusted maintenance cart, framed by the churning gray waters of the Columbia River bar and the white-capped chaos beyond the breakwater. Jimmy's weathered hands rested lightly on his cart handle, his steel-gray eyes calm, watching the approach without flinching. For a long heartbeat, the crash of waves and distant helicopter noise seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of boots on wet concrete and the whisper of Pacific wind carrying the scent of storm and salt. The captain stopped directly in front of Jimmy, close enough to see the faint line scars on his hands where rescue lines had cut deep during heavy weather operations, the salt-stained fabric of the red work shirt, the slight tremor in his fingers that somehow hadn't affected a single weather observation he'd made all morning. When he spoke, his voice carried easily over the assembled personnel without needing to rise above a controlled command pitch. "Mr. Dalton," Thompson said, his voice carrying across the silent flight line with resonating authority that seemed to vibrate through the concrete pilings and steel infrastructure of the station. "I need to ask you directly. Are you Bosun's Mate First Class James Hurricane Dalton, United States Coast Guard, Gulf of Alaska Rescue Operations, February 1974? The question hit the assembled Coast Guardsmen like a rogue wave. The name Hurricane Dalton rippled through the crowd in hushed, unbelieving whispers. Everyone who knew their service's history had heard the legend. Motor lifeboat CG-44300, 40-foot seas, 18 souls pulled from the edge of death when every meteorological model said it was impossible. Jimmy's weathered hands stilled on his maintenance cart, and for a moment something flickered behind his steel-gray eyes, not fear, but the profound weight of memories of mountainous seas and desperate radio calls, of faces pulled from freezing water when all hope was lost. He straightened slightly, and despite his age and humble work clothes, his posture held the unmistakable bearing of a man who had once stood at the helm facing death and refused to blink. "Was, Captain," Jimmy replied quietly, his gravelly voice carrying a weight that made every Coast Guardsman on the flight line lean forward. "Long time ago." There was a slight tightening at the corners of Thompson's eyes, the only outward sign of the impact. Then he drew himself to full attention, heels together on the wet concrete, back ramrod straight. His right hand snapped to his brow in a salute so sharp and precise it seemed to cleave the thick salt air. "Bosun's Mate First Class Dalton," Thompson said, his voice resonant and clear. "It is an honor to have you at my station, sir." A collective, stunned silence fell over the gathered Coast Guardsmen as the sector commander, combat-tested gold life-saving medal recipient, legend among legends, held that salute, arm locked, eyes locked on the old boat mechanic in the faded red shirt. Jimmy blinked once, then slowly straightened further, his spine remembering what his muscles had never truly forgot. His right hand came up, fingers aligned, and he returned the salute with a crispness that did not belong to a man his age. Senior Chief Harlan and Command Master Chief Rodriguez mirrored the captain a heartbeat later, their own salutes snapping up with equal precision. Down the line, several senior boat crew members who understood exactly what they were seeing found their hands rising in unconscious respect, the recognition spreading like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. When Thompson finally lowered his hand, he turned in one smooth motion to face his Coast Guardsmen. His voice, when he spoke, was no longer merely controlled. It was edged with a fury that made the cold Pacific air feel even more bitter despite the spray. "Coast Guardsmen," he said, his voice filling every corner of the flight line like a ship's horn cutting through fog. "You stand in the presence of one of the men who wrote the doctrine you study in heavy weather operation. Bosun's Mate First Class James Hurricane Dalton conducted rescue operations in the Gulf of Alaska under conditions that exceeded every survivability parameter we teach." Lieutenant Commander Martinez's face went from pale to ashen gray as the implications crashed over her like a 40-foot breaker. The man she'd been calling delusional, mocking for his old sailor superstitions, threatening with removal. He was a living legend of Coast Guard rescue operation. In February 1974, Thompson continued, his voice ringing with pride and barely contained rage. Then bosun's mate First Class Dalton was serving as coxswain of motor lifeboat CG-44300 when 3 fishing vessels began taking on water in rapidly deteriorating conditions off the Alaskan coast. The official forecast called for improving weather. Every meteorological model predicted the storm would move offshore. He took a step toward Martinez and Vance, his eyes never leaving them. Petty Officer Dalton read conditions those instruments missed: hydraulic interference patterns, pressure gradients, undertow signatures that no satellite could detect. He recognized the signs of localized acceleration zones that would turn manageable seas into survival conditions within minutes. Against the forecast, against orders to stand down, he took his boat across the bar and into 40-foot seas. Senior Chief Harlan's voice came in, low and hard as gravel grinding against a hull. For 18 hours, in mountainous seas that exceeded the design limits of his vessel, he conducted rescue operations that saved 18 lives. His ability to read water conditions that instruments couldn't measure meant the difference between recovery and body retrieval. His innovations in heavy-weather seamanship and hydraulic pattern recognition are still taught at the National Motor Lifeboat School and every Coast Guard training facility in the country. Command Master Chief Rodriguez stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of maritime operations. His call sign, Hurricane, was earned because he was the only coxswain willing to go out when the weather service said it was impossible, and he brought everyone home every single time. Enemy of the sea, friend to every soul in distress. Thompson's withering gaze locked onto Lieutenant Commander Martinez. Commander, is it accurate that you questioned this Coast Guardsman's weather assessment credentials, that you publicly mocked his oceanographic expertise and intended to have him removed from this station, that you dismissed his warning about hydraulic interference zones as old sailor superstitions? Martinez's throat seemed to close, her skin gone from wind-burned red to ashen shock. Sir, we didn't. He never said what, Commander? Thompson's voice dropped to something quieter, more dangerous than any shout. That he'd earned the right to read ocean conditions you can't see, that he has more hours at the helm in survival conditions than your entire flight crew combined. That maybe, just maybe, when a man like that tells you the bar is breaking wrong and brown water means death, you shut your mouth and listen. The assembled Coast Guardsmen stood frozen, shame and shock mixing in equal measure like oil and water in a storm. The heavy salt air seemed to crackle with tension as the full weight of Martinez's mistake became clear to everyone on the flight line. She had not just disrespected an elderly civilian, she had committed an act of sacrilege against one of the most legendary coxswains in Coast Guard history, and every sailor in that crowd now understood the magnitude of her error. The gray Pacific sky seemed to darken as Captain Thompson gestured toward the churning waters beyond the Columbia River bar, the white-capped chaos now building with the ominous rhythm Jimmy had predicted hours earlier. "Bosun's mate First Class Dalton," Thompson said with profound respect, his voice carrying across the wet flight line. "These Coast Guardsmen need to understand what real seamanship looks like. Would you honor us by demonstrating exactly what you saw in those ocean conditions that our instruments missed?" Jimmy approached the observation platform, overlooking the bar with the methodical precision that had kept crews alive through impossible conditions. His weathered hands steady despite their age-related tremor as he examined the water's surface with steel-gray eyes that had read death in 1,000 different wave patterns. The assembled crowd of over 30 Coast Guardsmen formed a reverent semicircle around the platform, their earlier mockery replaced by hushed anticipation as they watched the old boat mechanic transform from humble support staff into master instructor. "The problem isn't your equipment or your training," Jimmy said quietly, his gravelly voice filling the silence as he pointed toward the specific patterns beyond the breakwater. "You're trusting instruments that only measure point conditions, wind speed here, wave height there, barometric pressure at this buoy. But the ocean is a system. You have to read how all the pieces interact to understand what's really happening." He gestured toward the north jetty where foam lines were running in chaotic spirals. "See how that foam is moving counterclockwise against the prevailing wind? That's not surface wind. That's undertow pulling bottom sediment up and creating rotational currents. When you see brown water mixing with white water, it means the hydraulic forces are strong enough to hold a swimmer down for 2 to 3 minutes. No amount of physical conditioning matters if you can't reach the surface to breathe." Senior Chief Harlan positioned high-powered binoculars to observe the exact conditions Jimmy described, his weathered face showing growing recognition as he studied the hydraulic patterns through the glass. There's a complete current reversal in that zone, he breathed. The surface flow is moving opposite to the deeper currents. That's a hydraulic trap our buoys can't detect because they only measure surface conditions. Jimmy nodded, pointing to another subtle indicator that spoke of violence building beyond the horizon. Now watch the wave intervals at the bar. See how they're stacking irregular, two smaller sets, then a pause, then a massive set. That's pressure wave interference from the storm system interacting with the river outflow. Your forecast models assume linear wave progression, but when you get constructive interference like this, you get rogue waves 30% larger than the prevailing sea state. That's what'll flip a helicopter or snap a rescue basket cable. As if choreographed by the ocean itself, a massive set suddenly appeared beyond the bar. Waves easily 25 feet high with near-vertical faces, exactly as Jimmy had predicted. The assembled Coast Guardsmen watched in stunned silence as the manageable 15-foot seas, their forecast had promised, transformed into survival conditions within minutes. The brown sediment mixing with white foam created a churning chaos that looked less like water and more like a living predator seeking to devour anything that entered its domain. Lieutenant Commander Martinez stepped forward, her face ashen not just with shame, but with the horrifying realization of what she'd almost sent her swimmers into. "Bosun's mate Dalton," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "if we'd launched that training evolution, if you hadn't warned us, your swimmers would be fighting for their lives right now." Jimmy finished quietly, his steel-gray eyes meeting hers with no judgment, only the weight of experience. "And your helicopter crew would be trying to extract them from hydraulic conditions that would make recovery nearly impossible. Some of you might not have come home today." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a worn photograph, a black and white image of a younger man at the helm of a motor lifeboat, spray frozen in midair around him, his face showing the focused intensity of someone fighting the ocean and refusing to lose. Beside him in the photo, 3 rescued fishermen wrapped in blankets, their faces showing the hollow-eyed shock of men who had glimpsed death and been pulled back from its edge. "This was taken after the Gulf of Alaska rescue," Jimmy said quietly, his voice weighted with memory and loss. "We pulled 18 people out of the water that day because I read conditions the forecast missed. But I've also stood on piers and watched good Coast Guardsmen go out when they shouldn't have, trusting instruments over intuition, following forecasts over ocean sense. Some of them didn't come home." His weathered hands trembled slightly as he held the photograph, the faces of long-dead shipmates staring back at him across the decades. "My engineer that day was a kid from Oregon named Tommy Chen. 22 years old, wanted to be a marine biologist when he got out. He trusted me when I said the forecast was wrong, when I told him we were going out in conditions that should have killed us all. Every person we saved that day lived because Tommy believed in reading the ocean instead of trusting the computers." His voice grew softer, carrying ghosts only he could see. "Tommy died 3 years later on a different rescue, different station, different coxswain who trusted the forecast instead of the water. The ocean doesn't care about your degrees or your technology. It only responds to respect and understanding earned through salt water and fear." Captain Thompson stepped forward, his expression shifting from professional authority to something approaching reverence. He reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew something that caught the gray Pacific light, a gleaming gold life-saving medal, the Coast Guard's highest award for heroism, suspended from its distinctive red, white, and blue ribbon. The medal seemed to pulse with its own inner light, carrying the weight of 18 lives saved when every model said it was impossible. "Bosun's mate First Class Dalton," Thompson said formally, his voice carrying across the silent flight line like a ship's horn cutting through fog. "You were awarded this medal in 1974, but the presentation was made at a small ceremony in Alaska that most of the service never knew about. It's time the current generation understood what this represents." Thompson carefully pinned the gold life-saving medal to Jimmy's faded red work shirt, the gleaming gold medal stark against the sun-bleached, salt-stained fabric that had been the target of ridicule minutes before. The symbol of ultimate maritime heroism stood in sharp contrast to the humble work clothes, transforming them from objects of mockery into vestments of honor. "This medal," Thompson announced to the assembled Coast Guardsmen, "represents more than heroism in a single rescue. It represents a lifetime of putting others before self, of reading conditions that instruments can't measure, of understanding that our mission isn't about following forecasts. It's about bringing people home alive." Aviation survival technician First Class Vance stepped forward, his face showing the hollow-eyed realization of how close he'd come to leading his swimmers into a death trap. The swagger and arrogance that had defined him hours earlier had been completely stripped away, replaced by the raw vulnerability of someone who had glimpsed his own mortality and found it wanting. "Bosun's mate Dalton," he said, his voice cracking with emotion, "I owe you an apology that words can't express. You were trying to save our lives, and I mocked you for it. I questioned your knowledge, your experience, your right to offer guidance. If you hadn't spoken up, if you'd stayed silent after the way we treated you, some of us might not be standing here." Jimmy looked at the young rescue swimmer, seeing not the arrogant operator who had tormented him, but another Coast Guardsman learning hard lessons about humility and the true cost of pride. "Petty officer," he said gently, placing a weathered hand on Vance's shoulder, "you are trying to accomplish the mission. That's what we train you to do. But the ocean has been killing confident people for thousands of years. Technology is a tool, not a replacement for water sense. The mission isn't to prove how tough you are, it's to bring everyone home, including yourself." Captain Thompson's voice carried across the flight line with absolute authority, cutting through the salt air like a blade. "Effective immediately, Bosun's mate First Class Dalton will serve as our senior maritime operations advisor. His primary duty will be establishing the Dalton Protocol, integrating traditional seamanship with modern forecasting technology. Every Coast Guardsman at this station will learn that instruments provide data, but the ocean tells stories that only experience can read." Jimmy nodded slowly, his weathered features showing quiet satisfaction mixed with the weight of responsibility. "I'd be honored, Captain, but I still want to keep my boat maintenance duties. There's something about keeping the equipment ready, making sure the boats and aircraft are there when someone needs help. That's important work, too." The transformation that followed was gradual but profound, like the tide changing imperceptibly until suddenly the entire shoreline was different. Martinez, facing career consequences for her conduct, was reassigned to the training division where she became Jimmy's most dedicated student. The officer who had once mocked the old boat mechanic now began every weather briefing with the same acknowledgement. "A coxswain taught me this the hard way: never trust a forecast that contradicts what the water is telling you." Within weeks, Dalton indicators became standard terminology at Cape Disappointment, subtle environmental signs that supplemented electronic forecasts with the kind of wisdom that could only be earned through decades of reading the ocean's moods. Every Friday afternoon, the station's heritage room filled with Coast Guardsmen as Jimmy, still in his faded red work shirt and worn boots, shared stories not of personal glory, but of the ocean's power and the young Coast Guardsmen who had trusted him to read it correctly. The casual disrespect that had once characterized interactions with the old boat mechanic was replaced by respectful greetings of "Good morning, Hurricane," and the understanding that the greatest seamanship often walks among us in work clothes, asking for nothing more than the chance to honor the memory of those who never made it home from the sea. 6 months later, during a pre-deployment briefing for a newly arrived rescue swimmer, the young Coast Guardsman noticed Jimmy quietly observing from the back of the room, his gold life-saving medal catching the fluorescent light as he took notes on weather conditions. "Captain," he asked Thompson, "why is the boat mechanic in our operational briefing?" The room fell silent as if someone had thrown a switch. Every veteran of that gray morning turned to stare at the young swimmer with expressions ranging from disbelief to pity. Thompson smiled grimly, the expression of a commander who had learned hard lessons about assumptions. "Because, petty officer, before any of us were here, men like him were reading ocean conditions that our best instruments still can't detect. And because everyone at this station operates in the shadow of what men like him already paid for in salt water, fear, and the kind of seamanship that no computer can ever replicate." After the briefing, the young swimmer found his way to the boat bay, where Jimmy sat alone in the gathering dusk, looking at his gold life-saving medal now properly displayed on his desk alongside the faded photograph of that long-ago rescue, not prominently, but where he could remember the weight of the promise he'd made to Tommy Chen and every other Coast Guardsman who had trusted him to read the water right. "Bosun's mate Dalton," the swimmer asked quietly, his voice carrying the respect that comes from understanding you're in the presence of something larger than yourself. "Sir, could you teach me about reading ocean conditions?" Jimmy looked at him, then at the gold medal that represented 18 lives saved when the forecast said it was impossible, and finally back to the young Coast Guardsman whose eager face reminded him of Tommy Chen and a dozen other young sailors who had trusted their lives to his judgment. He patted the chair beside his desk, the gesture simple but weighted with decades of accumulated wisdom. "Sit down, son," he said, his gravelly voice soft in the quiet boat bay. "It's not really about the ocean. It's about the people who trust you to understand it. But I'll tell you what I remember about keeping that promise." And in that quiet boat bay, as Pacific rain began its evening rhythm against the hangar windows, another link was forged in a chain stretching back through mountainous seas and impossible rescues, through the faces of people pulled from certain death and the coast guardsmen who refused to let the ocean win. A chain of mariners who understood that true seamanship doesn't announce itself with advanced degrees or sophisticated instruments. It endures humbly in faded red shirts and maintenance bays, waiting for someone worthy to ask the right questions and listen to the answers that keep the next generation of Coast Guardsmen alive. Jimmy Dalton continued his quiet service, but now he worked among Coast Guardsmen who understood that legends don't always live in museums or award ceremonies. Sometimes they maintain boats and check equipment, carrying a lifetime of hard-won knowledge and the profound responsibility of keeping faith with those who had trusted their lives to his ability to read the ocean's language and never made it home to tell their own stories. The call sign, Hurricane, lived on, not in the sterile pages of service history, but in the humble work of an old man who still moved through boat bays and flight lines, honoring the memory of Coast Guardsmen who had stood beside him against the sea, and earned the right to be remembered by someone who understood the true weight of a gold life-saving medal earned in blood, salt water, and the kind of seamanship that no forecast could ever capture.